Welcome to Roll for Insight, the D&D podcast where we dive into the game, the lore, and the internet's favorite arguments. Grab your dice and your character sheet, and let's roll for insight. Hello, welcome to Roll for Insight. In this episode, we're going to be talking about Alchemist supplies from the 2024 D&D Player's Handbook. Now, tools are probably one of the most overlooked parts of D&D, but they can open up a lot of creative problem solving and utility if your table leans into them. And Alchemist supplies proficiency is one of the more popular choices to take and then never use. So, in this episode, we'll cover what Alchemist supplies are and what you can actually do with them. We'll cover the crafting rules and examples. We'll talk gameplay uses, plus some benefits and limitations of picking up Alchemist supplies. Of course, we'll pull some opinions and ideas from the internet, and then we'll end on some fun fact information. Okay, first topic, the tool description. So, Alchemist supplies cost 50 gold piece to purchase. The weight is 8 pounds, and the associated ability for checks is intelligence. Now, the Alchemist supplies in general represents things like chemical tools and mixing equipment and bottles and reagents and compounds, so you're essentially a low-level chemist. Now, talking about what you can actually do with the utilize action. So, with Alchemist supplies, there are two main utilize actions you can take on your turn. The first is you can identify a substance. The difficulty class given is 15. So, for example, you can identify potions, poisons, and other unknown liquids. So, identifying a substance, to give you some examples when you might want to do this, if you find an unlabeled potion vial in a dungeon, or if someone offers you a drink and you might suspect poison. You could discover strange liquid in a trap mechanism. You could loot a lab filled with unknown chemicals and you want to identify them. There could be a spill in a cave and you don't know if it's acid or oil or water. You could be investigating a crime scene and you could find residue on a weapon or a surface. So this is especially useful in the mystery or intrigue or trap-heavy campaigns. Now, the other thing you can do is you can start a fire. The difficulty class given is also 15. Now, this is also useful in the grittier campaigns where you might not have things like a tinderbox or conditions are damp or there's some sort of emergency scenario. So this is a pretty minor one, but it is consistent utility. So a couple of example scenarios where you may need to start a fire. Your party could be caught in a storm and everything is soaked. Now, you could be in a cave with no light source and you need immediate visibility. You might need to burn evidence quickly, or you might need to create a signal fire for rescue or communication. You might want to ignite some oil or flammable terrain during combat. You also might need to survive in wilderness conditions without proper gear. Or you might need to create a distraction, and a fire is a great way to do that in most scenarios. So this becomes more important in survival-focused and low-resources campaigns. Now let's take a look at the crafting ability here, because that's also a large part of what makes Alchemist supplies pretty cool to pick up. But before diving into the actual items, let's review the core rules for crafting. So first off, you need to have the raw materials worth half the item's cost rounded down, so the price is set in the handbook, and it's up to the DM discretion as to whether the appropriate raw materials are available either for purchase or in the surrounding environment. So small villages may not have all the alchemical materials you want, or if you're in the middle of the forest, you probably can't get access to everything you need. So sometimes pre-purchasing the raw materials can be beneficial, so you got to make a shopping list. Now, the time required, you take the cost, not in the raw materials, but the full price, and then divide that by 10, and that equals the number of days rounded up. The work itself is 8 hours per day, which does not need to be done in consecutive days. So generally, crafting things is going to be a downtime activity, not a middle of the adventuring day kind of thing. Now, generally, characters can also combine their efforts to shorten the crafting time. So you can divide the time needed to create the item by the number of characters helping. Normally, only one other character can assist you, but the DM might allow more assistance. So it's also important to note that the helpers do need to be proficient in crafting that item to lend assistance. But again, this can also be a DM judgment call based on what is being created. Now, a common question that comes up is downtime crafting, like when does this actually take place? So realistically, you might have time to do crafting when the party is spending a few days in a city between quests, or if they're traveling long distances with no immediate threats, you might have time to do some crafting. You could be recovering after a major fight while waiting for healing or information. Your DM might allow some partial progress during long rests in safe environments, or if your campaign has like a time skip or a narrative downtime, or if you're running a base or a stronghold or operating out of some home location. So this can be very campaign dependent, and it is definitely worth discussing it with your DM if you want to start doing these kinds of things. Now, for the example that the Player's Handbook gives, it's if you're crafting a heavy crossbow. So as an example, the item price for the heavy crossbow is 50 gold pieces. So the item cost is 50 gold, divided by 10, it takes 5 days to craft. The cost is 25 gold piece because that's half of the purchase price in raw materials. And this is downtime based, so it's not combat crafting, and you don't have to roll to see if you succeed now. So now we need to look at what Alchemist supplies allow you to specifically craft, and we'll talk briefly about each of those items and the cost and the time and what you can actually do with it. So the first thing on the list is acid. Now the cost is 25 gold pieces to purchase, so the raw materials cost 12 gold pieces, and it takes 3 days to craft. The effect that you get from acid, it can be thrown as an attack 20 feet, and it requires a dexterity save or taking 2d6 acid damage. So this is a pretty reliable ranged damage option, and it can be useful if you're conserving your resources. Now, besides acid being used for combat, you might use it to do things like melt through locks or chains or rusty hinges or bars. You could also use it to destroy things like documents or evidence, or you could create distractions with it. You could damage equipment or your surrounding areas. You could use it to sabotage things like wagon wheels or enemy supplies. You could also clear obstacles out by using it to corrode the mechanisms. So think of the acid as a little destruction tool as well. Now, you can also make something similar, which is Alchemist's Fire. Now, the purchase price listed for Alchemist's Fire is 50 gold pieces, and that means to craft it, you need 25 gold pieces in raw materials, and it takes 5 days to craft. Now, the effect for Alchemist's Fire, it's a dexterity save, or you take 1d4 fire damage, and then you take 1d4 ongoing damage each turn from the burning condition. Now, this can be extinguished with an action, but there's quite a few uses for Alchemist's Fire, besides the damage over time effect, and besides forcing the enemy to waste actions to put out the fire. So you can use it to do things like block hallways, or you can force enemies to move from where they are, or risk taking more fire damage. You can also use the fire side to spread fear in creatures or NPCs. You can use it to destroy objects like webs or wooden barriers or other flammable structures. You can use it as an interrogation or intimidation method. It's a great visual threat depending on the table tone. And you can use it to do things like set traps. You could pre-light a zone that the enemy is going to be entering. So it's less about the actual damage and more about applying that pressure and control to the situation. Now, another thing you can create is oil. So the cost to purchase oil is 1 silver piece, so it's very cheap to purchase the raw materials there, half a silver or 5 copper, and it takes 1 day to craft. Now, some uses for oil, you can throw it for a bonus to fire damage, or you can cover the ground in it to create a burning area. Now, oil is also used as fuel for lamps and lanterns. You get about 6 hours total. But there's a lot of different things you can do with the oil. So in combat, you can combine it with fire for bonus damage, you can create a burning terrain zone, or you can force enemies to have to reposition. There's a lot of utility and creative uses here, so I'll go through a couple. You can use it to lubricate stuck doors or rusty mechanisms. You can help reduce noise from hinges or machinery. You can use it obviously as fuel for lamps and lanterns and long-term light sources. But you can also, and again, depending on the DM, you can use it to make surfaces slippery, putting oil at the top of the stairs. right? You can preset ambush traps, or you can signal or mark different areas with the oil. But it's one of those very versatile, low-cost items that's in the game. So when it comes to these first three, the acid, the alchemist fire, the oil, these are like the resource-light alternatives to spell casting. You've got some damage, you've got some pressure tools, and you've got some combo tools. Now another thing you can make is a component pouch. This one's pretty straightforward. The purchase price is 25 gold pieces, so it takes 12 gold pieces in raw materials and 3 days to craft. Now, this pouch is where you hold the free material components for your spells, and it is essential for spellcasters to have one, and it's basically backup gear if you lose yours. But besides just being a backup for spellcasters if you lose or have yours stolen, there are some roleplay things you could do. You could flavor your spellcasting with the physical components if you lean into that more. Or you could craft these to give them away as gifts or to sell them for a way to earn money. Now, another straightforward thing you can make is paper. The cost to purchase is 2 silver pieces, so it requires 1 silver piece and a day to craft. The effect is straightforward. It can hold about 250 words, but you can use paper for a lot of things. And again, in some campaigns, you may never track this stuff. In others, you may need to watch what you're doing. So you can use paper for things like notes and maps and communication. You can write out your plans. You can write letters. You can leave messages for allies or NPCs. You can forge documents or fake orders. You can use it in puzzle solving scenarios where you might need to sketch symbols or patterns. You can use it for record keeping and track your clues and names and leads. So paper does become a very valuable resource in the investigation or roleplay heavy games too. But again, not all tables track this. Now the last thing you can make is perfume. Now perfume, the purchase price is 5 gold pieces, so it takes 2 gold pieces in materials and 1 day to craft. Now, the effect of perfume is it gives you advantage on persuasion checks against indifferent humanoids within 5 feet of you. So this one is very specifically like a social encounter or roleplay heavy campaign tool to use. And while it isn't explicitly stated in the handbook, typically you'll get a ruling that you can get about 10 to 20 uses per vial of perfume that you create. So perfume is great for the social advantage because it can help improve first impressions, and you can use it to help influence NPCs, especially things like merchants or nobles or guards, anyone where you're going to be within that 5-foot range of. Now you can also use it as a disguise to mask your scent or appear higher status than you might be. You can use it in a roleplay scenario to help blend into high society, or you can use it to cover up odors like blood or travel grime or suspicious smells. And it's situational, but it is very strong in a lot of social campaigns. And with perfume, you can also consider smashing the entire vial. In real life, if you've ever broken a perfume bottle, you'll know how strong that entire bottle will be. Now, looking at that perfume for the social persuasion, the planning, the deception, the communication, you've got a lot of options for what you can do with this one. So now let's back up and look at the overall benefits and limitations of the Alchemist supplies. So some of the benefits, you get access to those craftable combat items. You've got really strong downtime value too. If your table has downtime, but you never really know how to use it, this is a great thing to work on. It gives you a lot of versatility across a few categories like the combat, the exploration, the social play, and the roleplay uses, and it does scale with your creativity and then your planning. Are you using the downtime to make these things and then using them later on in your campaign? So this tool really shines if you do get access to that downtime and you do plan ahead and you prepare for those encounters. Now, on the limitation side, it does require downtime. So if you're in a very quick-paced campaign or one where you don't really get that rest time, you're not going to have that time to actually make things. It also does require that gold investment to craft things. It's not an instant turnover, and you can't automatically sell the things that you make. Now, some of these items are also quite situational and are easily replaced by spells or just by buying them from a market like the paper and the oil. So it does depend pretty heavily on the DM's interpretation of rules and the crafting opportunities here. But let's take a look at some of the big practical creative uses and the big picture of the Alchemist supplies here. So you can have some ambush setups by putting oil on the ground and have the Alchemist fire ready for ignition. You can have a break-in scenario. You might have acid on the lock and oil on the hinges, and that equals a silent entry. You could also look at escape scenarios here, where maybe there's an oil spill with the ignition and that blocks off any pursuers. You've got social infiltration to this with the perfume and the forged papers. You can pass off as a noble. There's a lot of dungeon survival stuff like paper for mapping, oil for keeping those lanterns lit, and acid for any obstacles you come across. And last, pouring that acid on any sort of control panel can help make it malfunction. Now, let's turn to the internet discourse around Alchemist supplies here. So, a pretty common issue is that crafting in general is just ignored. A lot of tables just skip or hand wave the downtime away, and that could make tools in general, not just Alchemist supplies, feel weaker. But that's why having a conversation about incorporating things like downtime is important. There are a lot of things you can do between sessions too. So if your table doesn't want to spend time at the table to work on these things, it could be as simple as having a group message with the DM saying, hey, you have 7 days of downtime with your characters resting. What do you want to work on in that time? So you do it behind the scenes, so when you come back to the table, you've got a few vials ready to go for your character. Another common take is that the oil is actually quite underrated, because a lot of characters use this because it's cheap and flexible and it combines really well with fire. It's one of those really good low-cost items in the game, but again, you have to use it to see that impact. Alchemist Supplies also has a pretty big reputation for being pretty great at low levels, but a lot less impactful as you level up, because things like the Alchemist Fire and the Acid, they are strong early on when you might not have as many special tools or skills under your belt. But again, like many things in D&D, Alchemist Supplies does reward the preparation. So players who like to plan ahead and stockpile items and use their environment, this is not a reactive thing to use. This is a planner's tool. So one case scenario, which might be DM dependent on whether they'll allow it, but during a siege or if you're defending a village, especially with the rules of crafting and helpers, you could consider creating essentially an assembly line for things like oil production. You can have the villagers assist in creating large quantities of this to defend an area. They could functionally cover exits, having the oil and fire to drop down on attacks from up on walls, and it can turn non-combatants into useful allies if the occasion calls for it. So again, DM discretion, but a lot of these tool uses are about thinking outside the box. So to end this episode on the fun facts for the Alchemist Supplies. Now, alchemy in fantasy and D&D is based on real-world early chemistry. So earlier versions of D&D usually had a pretty broad scope of what you could do with the alchemical supplies and the crafting, but 5.5 has really streamlined the rules for crafting and taken some of the complication out of it, including the failure rates and the consequences like ruining some of your raw materials. So alchemy in history is an ancient branch of natural philosophy that was historically practiced in China and India and Europe and was sometimes characterized as mystical or sacred or divine. And a common goal of alchemy was the transmutation of base metals like lead into noble metals like gold. And of course, the creation of an elixir of immortality or the creation of a remedy to cure any disease. And that's also the root of the mythic Philosopher's Stone that's capable of turning base metals into gold or silver or to create an elixir of life. And the earliest known written mention of the Philosopher's Stone goes back to around 300 Common Era in the south of Roman Egypt. So Alchemist Supplies help you be that low-level chemist in a fantasy campaign. Well, that's it for this session of Roll for Insight. Thanks for listening, and thank you to all our supporters on patreon.com/rollforinsightpodcast. And we will see you next time.